Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom with Bob Olson, who will now introduce today's show and speaker.
Welcome to the open door. I have left an open door before you which no one can close. Open to the love of God. Open to joining His stream of love for others. And before we get to our panel in introduction, this is a live show, and you can call in, and if you want to participate, if you have questions or whatever. And the number to call is 515-515-604-9344. 9344. And the code is 914121. All right? Now, our panel, we begin with Dr. Rhonda Chervin, Professor of Philosophy and Catholic writer in Corpus Christi, Texas. And then we have Dr. Jim Hannock from Los Angeles, philosophy professor, father of 5 children, pro-life activist, editor at New Oxford Review. And then we have Commander Al Hughes from Corpus Christi, Texas, colonel in the Air Force, a married father who converted to the church from being an agnostic, and also has degrees in engineering and in pastoral studies. All right, Al, take it away.
Thank you, Bob, and good morning to everyone. We often hear the phrase, you must always follow your conscience. And when we hear that, hardly anybody will ever follow that up with a definition. What is conscience? What does the word mean? So let's begin their panel with a definition of conscience that we're supposed to follow. What is the definition of conscience?
Okay, I would like to speak to what it is not, because I don't have my definition in front of me, though I teach this subject. But what people think it is and it is not is people think it's just this feeling, this and this is the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. And technically, what it is more is our knowledge of what is the right thing to do, combined with the feeling of the wrongness of doing something when it goes against our conscience as formed by certain truths about right and wrong. See, so someone may not have a bad conscience if you were brought up, for instance, in gang world and you were taught never hurt us, but you can do anything you want with the enemy. You may eventually have a breakthrough and see that it's wrong to kill other people in other gangs, but it wouldn't be registering in your conscience as you shouldn't do that because you haven't been taught that it's right or that it's wrong to do it, see? So in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it says that it must be an informed conscience, an informed knowledge of what is right and wrong, not just what you happen to be brought up thinking.
That seems on target. When we think of conscience, as Rhonda points out, we know that many people speak of conscience as a kind of subjective feeling, and that's mistaken. And a much more promising approach is the
I'd say, classical understanding of conscience, classical and philosophy understanding of conscience as one's last best exercise of practical reason. Now that needs unpacking, as they say. There's theoretical reasoning that broadly involves figuring out what's the case. Let's see what's the case. And you can reason theoretically about the nature of black holes, or you could reason theoretically about the species membership of that little thing that's crawling past you on the floor. But then there's practical reasoning, and practical reasoning involves reasoning, but instead of a conclusion that takes the form of that's a spider, practical reasoning has as its conclusion an action. You get up and you carefully pick up the spider and take it outdoors. Let's say, for suppose, that you do that. So when you reason practically, you're thinking about what you should do. And conscience, understood without a reference to the divine, but yet understood in terms of something distinctive, is one's last best exercise of practical reason. Now, when you reason about what to do, you have to reason from certain premises, and from the perspective of Christianity, the premises, the key premises, would come from God. There's this idea of conscience as a law written in our hearts. We recognize certain things as wrong, and that's a premise, and we recognize certain things as right, and that's a premise. And given such premises having to do with right and wrong, and then given premises about what's going on right now in front of me, or what's going on around the world, then we come to a conclusion about what I ought to do. Last best exercise of practical reason.
That's very, very well explained, Jim. And now there's a big controversy among philosophers, among Catholic philosophers specifically, as to whether you could have right conscience about something even if you didn't believe in God, given that God exists and that God has written certain laws of morality somehow into human nature. But some people think if there was no God, we wouldn't exist. So if there was no God, though, that you couldn't know, given that we do exist, an individual who is an atheist couldn't know right from wrong, and I don't think that's correct. I think even though someone doesn't have the premise that God exists, someone could just see by what von Hildebrand calls an intellectual apprehension. A person could just see that torturing an innocent person is something wrong, unrelated to whether God exists or not. But then in the wider sense, many, many atheists would be materialists, and even though they might have a sense of right and wrong because God put it into our nature to have such a sense, even so, it wouldn't make sense as a whole philosophy of life. If we're just a hunk of matter, what difference does it make what we do to another hunk of matter?
We could make a useful distinction, I think, between, we could call it the order of what is and the order of our knowing. And there are all sorts of things that are the case, but we don't know them to be the case. So I think in terms of the order of knowing, very often we wouldn't be able to state or articulate that God is the cause of such and such, but that doesn't mean that God isn't the cause of such and such. And it seems to me that an atheist might very well be able to act from at least an in part, a partially rightly formed conscience, not being able to trace it back to its origin, but in the course of things today and doing this, that, or the other thing, the atheist might have a well-founded last best exercise of practical reason.
This is Al. Excuse me, this is Al. I'd like to hitchhike on Jim's spider, which may now be crawling up his leg. Yes. Conscience. My conscience, like Jim's, would be to pick up the little critter and put him outside. My wife's conscience would be to stomp the little guy and then take him outside. Both of us have, I would presume, a good and right conscience, since we are both heavily involved in church and in right living. So how can we have that difference of opinion about the fate of the spider, and both of us do this in good conscience?
Well, I think one of us might be acting on a council of perfection. Or one of us might be engaged in intense dialogue with the Jains, spin-off from Hinduism that has a profound reverence for life in every aspect. I think in many cases there are a number of actions that would be perfectly legitimate, but one might have a reason to perform one rather than the other, and it wouldn't be a strict requirement of conscience.
Yeah, we want to make a distinction between things that are intrinsically evil, which no one should ever do, such as torturing an innocent person, and things where there are, we would say now gray areas, but it would be better to say things where there is no obligation not to do something, but doing one thing might be better, especially better for an individual. Now, both of them can involve conscience in the sense that I could believe that God, let's say, take conscientious objection. There are people who believe that even though some people may be called to defend their country in the military, that he or she is personally called never to kill another person, even an enemy who isn't innocent. And so therefore, this person would feel in conscience that they shouldn't do it no matter what. And for instance, generally speaking, priests in any war, priest chaplains, never carry a gun and never kill anyone in the course of that battle. So that wouldn't be something on everyone, that no one should ever kill anyone, even in self-defense or in war, right?
Well, Al oftentimes calls our attention to the role of vocation, and in following through the course of our lives, we had better attend to what our vocation is, and our vocation both opens up possibilities to us and at the same time, in a certain sense, forecloses possibilities to us. If we're going in this direction, then we have certain commitments that we make, certain responsibilities that we take on. So there is just a loose distinction. The idea of a gray zone, but then as you settle into your life, it becomes less and less gray, I think.
Well, I think that when we talk about a person has a calling, most of us are talking about the priesthood or something similar, but I guarantee you there are men who are called but to defend the nation. There are people who are called in many, many different vocations, not just the priesthood. And part of the vocation of the military is to protect individuals by protecting the individual's country. And that is a vocation. In Rwanda, there are cases where priests have found themselves on the front line in a foxhole, and I guarantee you they pick up a weapon and use it.
Oh, that's good to know. Okay, I should know that. Thank you.
Yeah.
And everybody knows they won't let atheists into foxholes.
That's because all the atheists went to Canada.
Now, if I could redirect
yes, please,
to concepts of conscience, every once in a while, I notice that a whole lot of people are saying such and such about a certain question, and I sometimes wonder, now, where'd they pick that up? All these people picking that up, and I probably don't really know. However, I can say this. Throughout this fair land of ours, there are any number of college students that at some point in their ethics courses discuss, believe it or not, Huckleberry Finn with regard to, yes, what conscience is. And one of the points of consideration with respect to conscience is whether or not one ought always to follow one's conscience. Now, in the story of the adventures of aforementioned Huckleberry Finn, there's a famous section where he's on a raft going down the Mississippi with Jim, a runaway slave. I don't know if you recall this section, or some of us probably aren't familiar with the story, but it's a famous episode in Huckleberry Finn going down the raft in the Mississippi, and he's on the lam from school, not caring much for it, and Jim is hoping to get to freedom. Well, Jim is a subject of interest. More than that, the authorities are on the lookout for Jim, so they stop various rafts going down the Mississippi. And when Huckleberry Finn's raft is stopped and Jim is aboard the raft, but he's not readily visible, the authorities ask him, have you seen Jim? And what he says is, no, I haven't seen Jim. I haven't seen Jim. And then the authorities go on and to the next boat, and then Huck reflects. That was where it pinched. Conscience says to me, what had poor Miss Watson done to you? All right, Miss Watson is the one person in town that actually cared about Huckleberry Finn. What had she done to you that you could see her slave, that was Jim, go off right under your eyes and never say one single word? What did that poor old woman do to you that you could treat her so mean? Why, she tried to learn you your book. She tried to learn you your manners. She tried to be good to you every way she knew. That's what she done. And as the passage develops, Jim says, well, in conscience, I should have turned the slave in. But I wasn't going to do it. And then he reflects some more and he says, I'm not quoting from the actual story, but what he says, and this is pretty close, is, so what's the point of conscience? If you break it, you don't feel so good, and if you keep it, you don't feel so good. So you might as well just forget about it. And there are, any given semester throughout the United States, tens of thousands of young people reading this and wondering about it. And if you're trying to present conscience in the sense of something that ought always to be followed, then there's this background. Well, I don't know. And of course the problem here is that Huck's conscience isn't rightly formed. he thinks that he ought to do what everybody in town says you ought to do, and especially ought to do it if it involves a runaway slave or this one lady who's been nice to you. You ought to do it. So he ought to have followed his conscience and turned in Jim, but he didn't. And he feels bad that he didn't turn him in, and he feels bad that he did. He feels bad that he broke his conscience as he presents it, but he would feel worse if he kept it, or he's not sure really how he feels, and off it goes. He goes down the river. And that's a commonly held a question or approach to thinking about conscience. Boy, I'd like to get that monkey off my back.
Well, isn't the issue which is the greater good? I mean, it's good to. I do remember reading that, by the way, as a teen, and I remember that passage. But now that you bring it up, but it's one thing to be good to Mrs. Watson. It's another thing to be good to poor old Jim, who's hiding under a blanket. And so the real issue is which is the higher good. I know even JP2 said that if you have to choose between two evils, you pick the lesser of the two evils, but you have to pick something. The same thing would be true with two goods. You try to figure out what the greater good is.
Well, it's a little more complicated than that.
Well, of course, you're a philosopher.
You're never supposed to choose something that is intrinsically evil, even if you could bring about a greater good. That's called the ends people who think otherwise, it's the ends justify the means, that if you have a greater good in mind, you can do something intrinsically evil. No, you're never supposed to do something. So let me continue. Do something intrinsically evil. And the lesser of two evils doesn't mean you can choose a less atrocious thing, like abort one of the babies in the womb instead of two. So it's not the lesser of two evils usually means in a legitimate sense. You have two bad things that could happen, which are not sins of yours. For instance, you're driving in a car and there's a car in front of you turning around in a circle. So you have a choice of either going to the right or to the left to avoid this accident. So on the right is a baby, on the left is a carton of beer. So you choose the lesser of two evils by running over the carton of beer. See, but it's not you're choosing something intrinsically evil in itself. Now, then comes the question, is lying something intrinsically evil under all circumstances? And ethical philosophers differ on this question. And some hold with a proposition that says that telling the truth is something you're obliged to do for people who have the right to the truth, and that someone who is doing something morally evil, like having slaves, doesn't deserve the truth, or the slave, the slave catcher doesn't deserve the truth. See, as in, if the Gestapo comes to the door to get the Jews that you have hidden in the attic, they don't have a right to know, since they're going to send them to the concentration camp. They don't have a right to know, so you can lie about it. That some people say that you have to define lie very carefully. Others say you should never say anything that's contrary to the truth, but you don't have to say anything. So they ask you, where are the Jews, or is the slave in your boat, hidden in your boat, and you say nothing. Then you get punished, but you haven't said something that's a lie. So, Jim, would you like to speak to that marvelous distinction?
Yes, I'd like to speak to it. It's a very difficult question. The first edition of the Catechism of the Catholic Church had basically two different definitions of lying. And the first definition said any intentional falsehood said in order to deceive another is a lie. And then, as I recall, it was on the same page in the Catechism. There was this second notion. Any intentional falsehood said to deceive another who has a right to know.
Oh, okay, now I understood, this makes it even more complicated, that the first version of the Catechism had it that way, and then it was changed back to you can't say anything contrary to the truth, but you don't have to say you don't have to say anything. You don't have to say, yes, the Jews are upstairs in the attic, or the slave is underneath the blanket. You don't say anything, and then you take the rap. Well,
you take the rap, but in many cases, your remaining silent is the admission of the accusation.
But at least you haven't done the wrong.
Let me jump in there, Jim. That's exactly right. Recall that Jesus stood silent before Pontius Pilate, and that silence was an affirmation that he said that he was who he said he was. He was God, you know. But rather than say it, he stood silent, and that affirmed his intention, his conviction that he was God.
Yes. Now notice we're getting away from conscience here.
A little bit.
We're going from conscience to a specific case of a conflict of conscience, which is fine, because when people talk about conscience, they're usually thinking about conflict cases. But this is immediately on target with respect to what's going on with the what's the acronym? Center for Medical Progress, I think is the term. David Daleiden, who's actually a member of our parish, God bless him, and a good friend of his, a woman that I can't think of her name right now, and the underground films that they have taken of various Planned Parenthood meetings and centers and so forth. They certainly did misrepresent themselves. Now, somebody might say, well, yes, but they misrepresented themselves to people who had no right to know what they were doing. And so, good for them. And
the church, greatly related, is the church has never considered spying for your country to be a sin, but spies always have to give false names and things like that.
Yeah.
So it's not as simple.
Evidently, the Holy See engaged in the manufacture and distribution of any number of false documents so that people could escape the Nazis.
Oh, no, I looked into that because it always comes up. And I was thinking that John the 23rd did this, but I was talking to a woman who wrote a definitive biography of John the 23rd, and she said, that was when he was in Turkey. He was a high church official in Turkey, and the idea was that he wrote these false baptismal certificates to get the Jews out of there. And according to this biographer, that's very much mistaken. He didn't sign anything that was written wrongly. He said that it was okay if other people made up certificates, but he didn't have someone, a priest or himself, sign them. They just looked like certificates, so in other words, it was a forged document of some sort.
The discussion is not limited to what he did. And it seems like in many cases something like that was done. But that's neither here nor there, because in many cases diplomats for the Holy See have done things that are wrong. So it's a very difficult question, and there's a lot of discussion about it. And I just posted, guess where, on the American Solidarity Party webpage, I just posted the latest thing that the Leiden has had released on these film exposés of Planned Parenthood. And I always think of that. And I think one of the things you could say now, go ahead, split a hair. If a hair is there, I say go ahead, split that hair. This is out now. Whether or not he ought to have done it or not ought to have done it is a very tricky question. He did it, I think, with the best of intentions, although he might very well have intended a wrongful means to do it. But it's all there. It's out now. It's sort of like research that's been done on something that was wrong research in the first place, but here it is. You have this polio vaccine. And that's difficult, too. So these are real questions of conscience, and there will always be real questions of conscience. And so that takes us back to our question, what the deuce is conscience? And unless people are very clear about what they take conscience to be, you can argue at cross purposes. Should you always follow your conscience? Well, no, if you're talking about some subjective conviction that you have, which, given some thought, will be shown to be a reflection of your environment and nothing more than that. But should you always follow your conscience? If it's your last best exercise of practical reason, then you should follow it, and even then you might do the wrong thing. But you should nonetheless follow it, because what's the alternative? Should I follow my last best exercise of practical reason, or should I flip a coin, take a poll? If you take coin flipping to be relevant or a poll to be relevant, then actually all you've done is brought your last best exercise of practical reason up to speed. Should I follow my conscience, or should I ask my mentor, Uncle Fred? Well, if you decide in favor of asking your mentor, Uncle Fred, well, that in effect is your last best exercise of practical conscience, because you're taking into account the wisdom of mentor Uncle Fred. So in a way,
here's one that's very upsetting to me. In the past, there were Catholics before Vatican II. There were many Catholics who thought, even if they weren't in mortal sin, if they had venial sins, that they should never receive communion at the Sunday Mass unless they had gone to confession on Saturday. So even if they only had venial sins, if they didn't get to confession on Saturday for whatever reason, they wouldn't receive communion. So that was erroneous conscience. On the other hand, try to convince them that they're wrong, and you could talk for 5 hours. Because nowadays it's a little easier, because you can actually click on canon law and search for almost anything, and if you're good at that, you'll find it out in 5 minutes what canon law says about the subject. But so there are people with scrupulous consciences. Nobody believes this now, but when I first became a Catholic, which was in 1959, we philosophers going to graduate school used to sit around the dining table talking about subjects like, if you ate an hour before receiving communion, but then you happened to lick your finger, which had gravy on it, then you shouldn't receive communion?
Yeah, that's the sort of stuff that I think that sometimes Pope Francis is referring to. That's the sort of stuff that you want to say, come on, get on with it.
Well, but then on the other side are all these people who, they're certainly more lax people, lax conscience, than scrupulous people. So lax conscience would be with sexual morality. Well, I watched this porn and I masturbated, but since I didn't have sex with the woman, it's not a sin. So, so that's all over the place. Just to be gross about it.
Now, believe it or not, there have been moralists in the past who said that, if your boss is your boss and he wants you to hold this ladder next to somebody else's house while he climbs the ladder and goes in and steals something, well, you're just, doing what the boss said, holding the ladder. So, well, people have to have a robust sense of reality, and there's no talking that'll take the place of that. I mean, this is a good point from philosophy. Give anyone a set of rules, right? Any rule. Anybody you want. I want a set of rules? All right, you got a set of rules. There's always the urge to have another rule to interpret that set of rules.
Isn't that how the Pharisees went from 10 commandments to 620-odd commandments?
I don't know, but
that same process.
If people are unsure about their own practical wisdom, there's always the urge to have somebody resolve the burdens of practical reason by giving them one more rule, but there's no end to that.
Yeah.
At some point, the person has to interpret it. Another rule is not going to help. Persons act, not rules.
Yeah. I learned a long time ago a word often has its own definition built in, like conscience does. Con, with, and the rest of that word is science. And what is science but a study of, a rigorous study attempting to find the truth about something? So that makes me think of conscience more as process than as conclusion.
Well, a key consideration here is we have this term science, scientia, knowledge, and then there's natural science, which involves empirical analysis and the like. But there's a broader kind of science. There's moral science, which can hardly ignore empirical context. You can't possibly do that if you open your eyes. At the same time, in moral knowledge, there's very often what's called an aspect of connaturality. We are able to understand something because we in some way share in its nature. And there are particular moral responsibilities that come with a connatural relation. So if you take, for example, the virtue of piety, well, very interesting. There's piety with respect to God, and that's what we might think of first. But then there's filial piety, the piety that we ought to have with regard to our parents and members of our family. And then there's patriotism, which is a form of piety. And there's something we share with the people who make up our polity, people of the United States of America. There's something we share with them, and because of that shared something or other, we have a special obligation. And then there's the fact that God is sustaining our nature and that we are made in God's image and likeness, and that gives rise to special responsibilities with respect to God. And then, of course, the family, filial piety. So in each of these areas of the application of piety, we can't overlook the role of a distinctive nature, and that's something different from the latest sociological poll on family relationships, say, which is important to know about, but it's a different sort of thing altogether than sharing by nature something profound with members of your family.
Very, very good. Now, I got upset by now, and I decided I should, instead of being lazy, I should Google Conscience Catholic Dictionary, and it brought me to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, where here is the definition given, that's section 1778. conscience is very much like what Jim Hannock said. Conscience is a judgment of reason whereby the human person recognizes the moral quality of a concrete act that he is going to perform, is in the process of performing, or has already completed. So it's a judgment of reason about this act. Well, this act is wrong because it is contrary to morality.
Yeah, that practical reason core, but you have to reason from premises, and you don't make up the premises. You
exactly.
have to reason from the premises, but you can't make up the premises.
So 1783 says, conscience must be informed and moral judgment enlightened. A well-formed conscience is upright and truthful. It formulates its judgments according to reason in conformity with the true good willed by the wisdom of the Creator. The education of conscience is indispensable for human beings who are subjected to negative influences and tempted by sin to prefer their own judgment and to reject authoritative teaching.
And that's how people misuse this idea of always following my conscience. What they really are saying, I followed my conscience because I followed my desires.
Right. Or many times they've just never been informed about why a certain thing is wrong. I mean, that's particularly true with contraception. Very few Catholics have a clear idea of why contraception is wrong. And so when their conscience doesn't bother them if they use contraceptives, it's not just that they want to do it because they want to do it, it's also because they don't see why it's wrong.
Yeah, that's part of it. And then there are people who would deny that there is such a thing as conscience to begin with. It's like they're denying a straw man. They're denying something that they don't understand anyway.
Yeah, but these same people, if they think something is unjust, then they use the word right and wrong every minute.
Oh yes, of course, yes. But they themselves declare what is right and wrong out of their own perceptions and desires.
One of the things that, to illustrate, one of the things that academics take to be of profound moral importance is intellectual property rights.
There you go.
Which is sort of like neighborhood block clubs. They have a profound commitment to property rights.
However, Jim, now I happen to read that Charles Dickens, who we all love, he was the one who pushed through copyright in the United States because he wasn't very wealthy, you know, and he was writing all these books, and they were being shipped to the United States, and then publishers in the United States and salespeople, bookstores were making $1 million on him, and he was getting nothing.
Yep. No,
and so he raised a big fuss about that, and presumably that's the derivation of copyright law.
But God love him, and for all I know, he's in heaven now. He wasn't so concerned about his wife's rights when he took up with a mistress and abandoned his family. Not much discussion of that.
Right.
Correct.
Yes. But I love his book so much that I don't focus my mind on that.
What does your conscience say about that, Rhonda?
It says that you could separate. I am not his judge, And I am not being asked to be the devil's advocate on his canonization, so I think I have a right to like his books anyhow.
Or you could think of it in more biblical terms. Consider them the spoils of Egypt.
There's a very interesting book, apropos, this is a long tangent, but Chesterton wrote a book on why, even though Dickens was not a Catholic and was not into the institutional church, that his books are filled with Catholic perceptions about human beings, just not explicit. So if you love Chesterton, you might read that sometime.
Well, there's much of that going on all the time with Shakespeare scholars. Catholic themes in Shakespeare, and was Shakespeare really...
Because it was so much, in those days, it was so much a part of the culture anyway.
That's right, yeah.
Oh, I had something else I wanted to bring in when I was praying about this session. I was thinking that moments in my own life where conscience played a huge role in making the right decision. And I have ones where I didn't make the right decision because I didn't consult my conscience properly, which I'm very ashamed of, but I'm not going to mention on the show. But a good one where I did make the right decision was I was involved with a case in Rome where the marriage tribunal was trying to decide if the man I wanted to marry, whether I could marry him in the church since he was married before in a civil marriage in Tijuana. Okay. And the New York court had turned us down, but then we learned that we could bring it to Rome. So my husband happened to get a job where he could choose, he was a book salesman, where he could choose any place in the world as his base. So he chose Rome, and before I was in graduate school, I worked my way through school as a secretary. I got a job as a secretary in, of all things, a Texas oil drilling company whose headquarters were in Rome. So
Christi?
No, not from Corpus Christi. No, in Rome. So I'm sitting doing oil specs on a typewriter. This is before. It was a horrible job, but I was there because I wanted to push through this possible dispensation. And we thought it would take a couple of weeks, but it took us a couple of years before we actually got it. But at one point, a canon lawyer happened to be coming through Rome that was a friend of someone, and he said, you'll never get this dispensation, just face it. So in my mind, it was, what do I choose? Earthly happiness, because I thought marrying my husband would be paradise. So earthly happiness or the church. And so I knelt down in prayer in my little apartment where I was living as an oil drilling secretary. And I knelt down and I prayed and I just said, well, I'm going to choose the church. And then, because it was against my conscience to say, as a Catholic, to say earthly happiness is more important than Jesus and the church. And then a couple of weeks later it came through. And it was a big, big moment of following my informed conscience over my desires.
Rhonda, maybe that brings up a topic we should talk about some other day, and that is obedience. Because I know personally that having made the right decision in favor of church, that obedience often leads to this immediately, almost, to the solution of the problem that you were fighting with. I know of examples of that. That obedience to the church ultimately is the act that brings about change in your life. And anyway,
that would be good to review such cases.
yeah, we can talk about that sometime. Oh, by the way, Rhonda, that decision you suggested, you go right and hit the baby, or go left and hit the case of beer. What you didn't say that was right behind the case of beer was a fast-moving greyhound.
Well, of course, now, an aspect of those kind of examples, we teachers, I was a professor of ethics for 50 years, so we teachers love to pick some extreme example to describe in order to force through our truth, right, or what we consider to be the truth, not our truth, the truth about any particular moral issue. And in a situation like that where you have 1 second to make up your mind, most people don't consult their conscience, pro and con, and then consult a mentor on the way, if you have 1 second to make the decision. So then afterwards you can ask yourself, well, why did I not even think of this solution? And I realized that, well, I was just so in a state of terror, I wasn't thinking straight about anything at that moment,
Yeah. There is too such a thing as a false dilemma. We often in trying to make a conscious decision, we think, well, I got to do this or that, and we neglect to consider other things like both may be right, both may be wrong. There may be another option. There's almost always more than two options, but we tend to make our decisions based on this false dichotomy, this false dilemma.
Okay. Now, I just thought of one for this thing with the Gestapo was at the door waiting, asking about where the Jews are. Instead of either saying no or nothing, you could suddenly collapse on the floor and pretend you're having a heart attack.
That could work.
And they rush you to the hospital. It turns out you're not, and the questioning proceeds.
Right, yeah. You guys or you could just step on the IV tube.
But as a matter of fact, people feel guilty about things their whole life that they shouldn't feel guilty about. For example, in a multiple car crash where you're in the middle between two cars. Now, the car in back of you is forcing your car to go right through the back seat of the car in front of you, and someone dies as a result of that accident. Someone will be guilty about that for their whole life, even though they had absolutely no desire to kill anyone in that car, and they couldn't possibly have avoided it, but they will still feel guilty. So that whole question of, this led into this whole phrase, which has been overused in the most awful way, which you're laying a guilt trip on me.
Yes.
That is such a phony phrase, because, many times it's a phony phrase. Like laying a guilt trip on someone would really be saying, if you're in venial sin, you can't receive communion. That's laying a guilt trip on people in a wrong sort of way. But many, many times, imagine if you would say to the policeman who's picking you up because you're speeding, don't lay a guilt trip on me, let me leave now.
Mm-hmm.
How well would that word go down?
Not so good.
But, in fact, I have met, it's really helped me understand certain conflicts in the church about these issues, is someone will just casually tell me, who's my age, 80, will tell me, when I was a kid, my mother would spank me if my hair was messy. Like extreme punishments for tiny things in the name of, cleanliness is godliness, say, or something. Like just extreme making things, it's called rigorism, making things obligatory that aren't obligatory, and then laying a guilt trip on people. And that's one of the reasons why some people are so keen on the idea of just make up your own mind and your own conscience. Don't just follow rules, because there were rules in the culture or the family that made no sense. As in, I remember during the big battle, the big things over the Vietnam War, that there were parents who actually killed their son because he had long hair. Stuff like that, So, there are horrible things in the name of right and wrong and rules that exist too. So, we could talk about this forever, but we're almost at the end, aren't we?
5 minutes, yes. And I was going to suggest everybody can, on the panel, you got just enough time to make a last statement if you'd like to do that. We're down to 4 minutes.
Here's a last statement from Jim, and it connects with what's just been presented. Very often, guilt is not warranted, and very often guilt that is not experienced is warranted, and it takes some real discernment to sift through it. Just as guilt is oftentimes said to be always mistaken, we have a lot of debates about shame, and so shouldn't be shamed. But there's a famous episode in fairly recent American history during the McCarthy trials, Joseph McCarthy, trials in the sense of social trials and legal trials and the like. There's a famous episode in which an attorney says to Senator McCarthy, "Sir, have you no shame?" And the idea is, look, you know you're a demagogue. We know you're a demagogue. Don't you have any shame? And many people who are wary of talking about shame are very much aware of that incident. And when you bring it to their attention, they'll appreciate that there is a role for calling people out and asking them whether or not they have any shame. And as somebody who's been involved in a lot of pro-life protests, very often pro-abortion people will say, "Aren't you ashamed of yourself?" Ironically, it's on an occasion in which I'm very much unashamed of myself, but I'm glad I'm doing what I'm doing. So you have to test all things, hold fast to that which is good, and use discernment, and be careful about how language is used, and watch to see how other people are using it. There's no excuse for thinking. There's no excuse for not thinking, is what I want to say.
We're out of time.
Which is a nice segue to our next topic next week, and that is the just war theory, which should be an opportunity for a great deal of debate. So until then, Bob, take it away.
Okay, and for those, like you said, we'll come back next week, same time, same station with the open door. And in the meantime, may God bless each and every one of you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
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 We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.